I think that we have a question from Martin Riley next about your years at West Point.
Mr.
West
Whistler,
Point.
hello again.
Hello again.
You're looking splendid for a man of 100 and something years old.
And so are you.
Thank you so much. Botox does a marvelous job these days. You spent some time at West Point, which wasn't the most glittering part of your life. Did it instill any discipline, or did it stoke a rebellious streak?
Did it instill any discipline in me?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Discipline has never been my strong suit. I was very rambunctious and adventurous as a boy, and I suppose some would say I never grew up. I fear I gave my parents, whom I dearly loved, a fairly hard time. Even before West Point, Father sent both me and Willie to a military-style boarding school in St. Petersburg in hopes of instilling a bit of discipline in us. Thankfully, that experiment lasted only a few months. It was a miserable experience for the entire family, especially my mother and sister. And so when I then became bedridden with rheumatic fever, my father admitted defeat. I intended to do well at West Point, if for no other reason than to honor my father's memory. As you may know, he was one of the Academy's most famous graduates. But I could never resist the temptation to flout the rules, and I found it impossible to give full deference and obedience to authority. I gained something of a reputation for recklessness, but my transgressions were never serious ones. Nearly all of my demerits were for such failures as not cutting my hair, or whistling in ranks, or having an untidy uniform. I suppose it was inevitable that I should nearly shatter all existing Academy records for demerits, but I have a rebellious nature which you must admit is also what made me such a great artist. And you may also know that another American genius, Edgar Allan Poe, was also drummed out of West Point because he could not adhere to its discipline. Now, that said, I never regretted my career at the Academy, and I was always exceedingly proud to call myself a West Point man.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Whistler. That's very insightful. I think our next question is from Stephen Bartley, also on the subject of West Point.
Good evening, Mr. Whistler.
Good evening.
Lovely to see you, looking so well. Just following on from Martin's question, despite a want of discipline, did your training at West Point and a tradition of soldiering in your family ever tempt you to join the Artists' Rifles when you moved to London in 1860? Your friends Rossetti and Swinburne had enrolled.
They did. As I recall, the regiment, as they fancied themselves, were formed to defend England against an invasion by France. That was foolish in its own right, but why should I want to fight against the French? It was pure folly. It was beneath the dignity of a West Point man. Now, Frederick Leighton commanded them, and proudly parading his minions around Hyde Park, Gabriel Algernon had resigned by the time I met them, and in any event, I had gone to London to establish my name as an artist, not to play at soldiering.
But, hello, if you don't mind me saying so, you are known for your pugnacious nature and physical altercations. Did you ever think of taking up boxing?
Boxing? Well, as you may have heard, I was never afraid of a fight, and I never backed down from a bully. I had my share of scuffles as a boy, often in defense of my younger brother, Willie. I recall one or two fistfights at West Point, too, although I suppose I'm best known for my combative altercations with people like Seymour Hayden and William Stott and Augustus Moore, and the occasional cab driver. However, I assure you that I never confronted anyone who had not clearly impugned my honor as a gentleman or that of a friend. Now, as for formal boxing lessons, I did, in fact, have a few with a well-known London pugilist. I believe his name was Reed. He was recommended to me by the old pre-Raphaelite crowd that I became associated with in London. You know, several of them were keen boxers. They insisted that pugnacity and aggressiveness were English traits that accounted for the nation's greatness. Ha ha!
Thank you.
Well said, well said. Thank you, Stephen and Diana. Dan Sutherland continues on in this same subject about West Point. Dan.
Oh, Mr. Whistler, I had a mechanical problem unmuting myself.
I understand.
But I want to follow up even further on your aggressive nature. I wonder if you, as a West Point man, was disappointed by the lack of military action you witnessed in Valparaiso between the Spanish and the Chileans when you were there.
Oh, right. Well, that, as you probably know, because Dan, I think you know almost as much about me as perhaps I do myself at this point. That was a pure fiasco. It was nearly as foolish as the artist's rifles. And yes, I was the advanced scout and agent in a scheme to sell torpedoes and torpedo boats to the Chileans in their war against Spain in 1866. You know, the problem was not as much a lack of action. The Spanish naval bombardment of Valparaiso demolished much of the town, but the failure of my associates to deliver the weapons in a timely manner. They did not arrive until 4 months after I had landed in Chile, and 2 months after the fighting had shifted northward to Peru, where it effectively ended. You know, we stood to earn a fortune from that deal, but wound up with nothing. And the only redeeming results for me were several paintings that I made at Valparaiso, which included my first nocturne.
Thanks for that, Dan, and thank you, Mr. Whistler. We're turning now to a different sort of question from Michael Biscoe.
Good evening, Mr. Whistler.
Good evening.
I'd like to turn to your art.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful idea.
Yes. Now, your father was a renowned engineer and would have done very precise drawings of all his projects. And I wonder how far his obvious ability for draftsmanship affected your own draftsmanship.
You know, that is an interesting question. It is difficult to say if it did influence me. It probably was an inherited gift. I drew compulsively from the age of 4 or 5, but I cannot recall ever having watched my father at work. But that said, he certainly encouraged my ambition to draw. He paid for me to attend the Russian Imperial Academy of Art when I was only 13. And when I was 15, we exchanged letters. I was at school in England at the time, in which he said, given my particular talents and likings, I recall that as the exact phrase that he used, I might make a splendid engineer or architect. Now, he died shortly after writing that letter, but I've always believed that once understanding how much I wished to be an artist, he would have supported my ambitions. I might also say that I've often wondered whether my fascination with bridges, which you can clearly see in much of my work, did that express a subconscious desire to emulate or honor him? I leave that to you.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Yes, it is fascinating. We have, I believe, the next question coming from somebody who unfortunately hasn't transited across to our Zoom call just yet.
What could be better than an audience with me, if I may be so bold?
I do, in his defense, I think Patrick was called off-site from his work and sends his sincere apologies. He also sent me the question he'd like to ask you.
Okay.
And again, it has to do with your art. He wonders if the work of Thomas Gainsborough and the English school of painters influenced your painting style or technique.
Well, you know, I rather admired Gainsborough in my youth, mainly as a colorist, and because Reynolds praised him in his discourses. I remember thinking that the portrait Sir William Boxall made of me when I was 15 looked like a Gainsborough, and I admired its beautifully creamy surface. But as a young artist in Paris, I rejected that style in favor of Courbet's rough realism and impasto approach. But I returned to it when I began painting my Nocturnes of the Thames, which I believe you must admit have a sort of an exquisite silken quality. And I achieved that look by applying the paint quite thinly, diluting it almost to the consistency of watercolor, which is a distinctly English trait. And this allowed me to work far more quickly. Was I thinking of Gainsborough? Perhaps. But I was equally influenced by my good friend Albert Moore. And then again, as concerned the traditional English school, I could not countenance the tiresome landscapes of someone like Constable. I recall telling Mortimer Menpes, one of my many young admirers, the Constable must have been a very athletic gentleman to have the energy to paint all those trees and leaves.
I'm sure Patrick will be delighted in listening to the recording of that answer. Thank you. Now we go to Anne Toomey, who has another question about your art. Anne, can you unmute? I know you're there, Anne.
You don't have to be shy, Anne. I won't bite.
She is on the call. It looks like she may have stepped away.
There she is.
I know, but I can't see her. Mr. Whistler, if we may, let's come back to Anne's question. And can we move on? Is Sarah Bogosian ready to ask her question of Mr. Whistler?
I certainly am. Hello, everyone, and especially Mr. Whistler.
Hello.
I'm thrilled to be here with you. I have this question for you, and then I have something I wanted to tell you that's somewhat related. But let me ask you the question first. Unlike Ruskin and Turner, your work in Venice captured a very different, more modern vision of the city. What was your inspiration in showing it as you did?
Well, first of all, let me congratulate you on coming to us from the Whistler House Museum of Art. It must be a splendid place. And I see, I believe, one of my paintings behind you there. I hope that is a reproduction. I'm not sure. But thank you for recognizing the uniqueness of my Venice work, because, again, it is what I would call Whistlerian. And it was something that escaped many foolish critics at the time. I created two artistic innovations in Venice, one in etching and the other in pastels. But before that, though, came the general inspiration. Because as you know, by that time, it was around 1880, I had a reputation for finding beauty in the unconventional and ordinary, and that's what I did in Venice. And as I prowled the less frequented parts of the city, I discovered complete harmonies and arrangements in narrow neighborhood canals and bits of architecture tucked away in small squares and secluded lanes. I saw a reality that had escaped every artist before me, and this affected how I portrayed Venice. In my etchings, I used a new staccato style with dots and dashes rather than strong continuous lines. I also structured scenes as geometrical patterns. I represented doors and windows, pillars and steps, archways and balconies as arrangements of squares and rectangles in order to emphasize the abstract over the concrete. And you probably know that as a theme throughout my work. And I did something similar with my pastels. Rather than drawing fully realized subjects and covering the entire paper with color, I gave mere impressions or outlines of what I saw. I also drew on plain brown wrapping paper, which gave the pictures a sort of a grainy, earthy feel, and the colors were mostly blue and orange. They yielded a lightness, a daintiness that matched the fairyland appearance of the city's polished marble and richly toned bricks and plaster. I hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you. So I just want to comment on Whistler's Mother painting that is behind me. It's what I call an original copy done by his cousin, Edith Fairfax Davenport, in 1906. He told her that she could paint it as long as she painted it exactly how she saw. And at the time it had darkened because of the mastic and cobalt varnish that he used on it. So that's why ours is darker. I can't tell if you can see it well because of the lighting right now today, but that's what that is behind us. And then I just wanted to let everyone know too, and to show you, I don't know if you could see this, but the Smithsonian put together a show called Sergeant Whistler and Venetian Glass. I went to see this exhibition at the Mystic Seaport Museum in Connecticut, a couple of weeks ago, and it had beautiful, beautiful etchings and paintings done by you and Sargent, and they brought in Venetian glass that depicted the beautiful Murano glass of the time when you were there. So I just wanted to let you know about that.
I love the glass. I do have to wonder, why drag in Sargent? But
I don't know. I was very disappointed about that too, but I didn't put the show together, so.
So do you have to travel far now?
Oh, I live in Badonsay, so it takes me.
Thank you for that, Sarah, and really appreciate you pointing that out and explaining the painting in the background. I had the privilege of actually going to the Whistler House Museum last year and seeing that painting in person. So thank you again, Sarah. Now, I think we have Anne Toomey. Anne, are you able to ask your question?
Hello?
Yes?
Hello? Yes, I just wanted to ask Mr. Whistler, good evening, Mr. Whistler. Could I just ask you which one of your paintings is your favorite?
Which one of my paintings is my favorite? I'm not sure. It is a bit like asking, which of your children is your favorite. Although, of course, we all know that we do have a favorite child and we just don't tell them about it. Possibly the one that is popularly known as the falling rocket. If for no other reason than that it reminds me of my terrific victory over John Ruskin in the courts. I know it was not exactly a financial success for me, but it was a philosophical success. And I believe that has always raised that painting in my estimation.
Oh, that's very understandable. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Anne. And I think in addition, we also wanted to ask you, Mr. Whistler, having acknowledged your early debt to Courbet, can you think of any French painters in your own circle, such as Fantin Latour, that you admired?
I was close to both Fantin and Alphonse Legros for several years. We grew together as young artists until Alphonse betrayed my trust And Fontaine simply failed, as he admitted, to understand my new direction in the latter 1860s. I later became friends with Monet, and I was always intrigued by Manet, who became something of an undeclared rival. In time, I was closest to Degas, who I must admit I found somewhat intimidating, both in his artistic cleverness and his blunt personality. For society, I would say I better enjoyed Tissot, if you wish to consider him French. But Degas was one of the few French artists whose advice I took seriously. I also grew quite close to Rodin. As a whole, though, when you speak of French artists or painters of my generation, people tend to mean the Impressionists, and I was miles ahead of those Johnnies. They only copied my earlier work. I declined Degas' invitation to contribute something to their first exhibition. I preferred to remain unique and not associated with any movement or school of art. My art was and remains, as I said earlier, Whistlerian.
Indeed, indeed. Now, I'm not sure if the next questioner has joined us. Bob Roach, are you on? I don't think he is.
May I add, Joan, he's having difficulty getting on. He's told me he was shut out. He tried. No, I know. And he's been trying everything. I actually have him on the phone with me so he can at least listen. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Just so everyone knows, Sarah and Bob both are on the board of the Whistler House Museum. So that's how they're connected. Mr. Whistler, Bob was interested in knowing, have you ever turned down a request or commission for a portrait?
Well, I cannot recall turning down a commission. I did return a few when I was displeased with the work I had done. Now, I returned £400, which I could scarcely afford, to Frederick Leyland when I was unable to complete a group portrait of 3 scantily clad young ladies he had commissioned. Then there was my encounter with Sir William Eden, which I describe in delicious detail in my pamphlet, The Baronet and the Butterfly. I believe this is still available in bookstores near you. Now, Eden, he gave me 100 guineas for a small sketch portrait of his wife in 1894, and I produced a splendid little painting, and it was so splendid, I thought it too good for a Philistine like Eden, so I returned the money. Now, he refused it and insisted on having the painting, and I refused to relinquish my work, so he sued me for £400. The case dragged on for 2 years in the courts, and I initially lost the contest and was told to return the painting and pay a hefty fine, but I won on appeal. And not only was I allowed to keep the painting, but the court also endorsed a principle that I had insisted on for years, that a work of art belongs to the artist, not to the grubby person who has happened to purchase it.
Yet another legal success.
Exactly.
Mr.
Now
Whistler, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
It's a chairman here in my throne. On a less litigious note, many of your portraits show the sitters not sitting but standing. First question is, why so? And secondly, did they have much time to themselves to sit down and take a breather?
Why would they need to take a breather? They were being immortalized. We were creating something beautiful. Now, I think what you may be getting at is, I admit that I lost track of time when painting, but really, I believe only children like Cecily Alexander and my niece Annie may have had reason to complain. And I apologize to both of them with gifts. Now, I've heard it said that I actually killed old Henry Cole by having him stand too long, but that is patent nonsense. His son Alan, one of my dearest friends, he never suggested such a thing. And in fact, The majority of my portrait subjects were not standing. Now, some, like my mother and Mr. Carlyle, were sitting. Some were reclining. With most of them, you see only the head or upper body. And what could be lovelier than my portraits of Lillian Wokes or the Little Rose of Lyme Regis? When I did have people stand, it was generally because there was something dignified in their manner or appearance that required it. Can you imagine Robert de Montesquieu, the finest dandy in France, lounging on a settee? Now, I also believe that a person's clothing, which can only be appreciated in a full-length portrait, says something about them. As for the women, their costume added color and style to a painting, unlike the men who universally wore black or drab colors.
Well explained and well said. Thank you. And thank you, Martin, for that. We come back again to Sandra Higgins, who has another question about your model and muses.
Hello, Mr. Whistler.
Oh, hello.
Hello, nice to see you again. I'm very interested in all the responses you've had about your art. So my question is, I think, about your sitters. Most of your, or some of your models or muses, I suppose that's quite different, tended to be redheaded. Is there any reason for that? And I might be asking that for an obvious reason.
I do like a bit of red hair, yes, I must say. I never really went in search of the redheads. They just happened to cross my path. Joe and Maud had been posing for other painters before I met them. Maybe it was because of their red hair. Rossetti, had created quite a demand for red-haired models. I adored Frances Leland for any number of reasons, and every man I knew was in love with Lily Langtry. In any case, I'm sure you will agree that red hair adds a perfect note of harmony to any arrangement.
Well, yes, of course I would agree to that. But I should also ask, which of your models or muses had the most influence on you? Of course, as a model, you may have admired their physical beauty. But as a muse, what influence did they have?
If you mean, did they influence my ideas or my style?
Yes.
Or my philosophy of art? No, I would say none of them. They did, however, sometimes affect the ways in which I expressed those ideas. For example, there was a time when I was intrigued by the work of Rossetti and the Pre-Raphaelites, and I'd been reading the poetry of Baudelaire. Now, Joe seemed the perfect realization of Baudelaire's poem, The Red-Haired Beggar Girl. Now, Maud came along at a time when I was interested in painting small domestic scenes, especially in watercolors. And while not precisely a muse, Millie Finch seemed the perfect embodiment of a liberated, seductive woman, so I made her one a la Goya.
Fantastic. Well done.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Sandra. Next, we go to Susie Hyde for another question about Christmas.
Hello, Mr. Whistler. What an honor.
Oh, I'm sure the honor is all mine.
So Christmas is fast approaching, and it's traditionally a time for reflection. It made me wonder, is there anything that you regret not having done in your lifetime?
Oh, that is difficult to say, since I would have to say that I did nearly everything I wished to do and achieved my most cherished goals. But if I think about it, I did at one time wish to be a member of the Royal Academy, and have been told I might have been elected had I behaved properly. But what does that mean? That I should not be myself? I mean, that's impossible. And I do wish that I had visited Spain to see the paintings of Velázquez. I nearly made it there once, traveling with Joe. We got as far as crossing the border from France, but then I decided to wait until Fontan could make the pilgrimage with me so that we could enjoy the master's work together. And we didn't ever make it. So yes, I suppose that is a regret as well.
What a pity. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. We've next got a question from Alice Berkeley. Alice, are you there? Can you unmute?
This unmuting technology seems to be excessively complicated.
Oh, no, here they are.
Yeah. Can you hear the question?
Yes.
Okay. We are calling you, Mr. Whistler, from Tite Street.
Ah, well, wonderful.
Very close to where you lived. And even closer lived Oscar Wilde. Now, in Tite Street, there are a number of buildings here which were designed by Edward Godwin, and I think he was your brother-in-law, if I'm not mistaken. And I just wondered if you'd like to give us a few reminiscences of your time in Tite Street and perhaps bringing in Edward Godwin and Oscar Wilde.
Well, I had some of the best times of my life there at my White House. But unfortunately, a lot of my most pleasant memories of that time are tainted by my bankruptcy and my having to leave under rather painful circumstances, you must understand. I enjoyed my time with Godwin. I would say that I had a difficult relationship with Mr. Wilde, particularly because he claimed to be an expert on art when in fact he knew nothing about it whatsoever except what he had heard from me. So he would go around giving his public lectures and proclaiming things as the great apostle of beauty, when actually he just picked the plums from our plates that he peddled to the provinces, as I would like to say. You may know that I had more than one altercation with Oscar about various things. I usually got the better of him. The one I think people like to remember most is we were at some party or another, and I made one of my characteristic witticisms, and Oscar said, "I wish I had said that." And I replied, "You will, Oscar, you will."
Oh, thank you for that. Following up on the previous question, Mr. Whistler, was there a time in your life when you were the happiest?
When I was the happiest, well, I enjoyed my mortal life exceedingly. I suppose I had fits of the blues and depression, doubts, uncertainties, like everybody else, but they never lasted long. There was always a new challenge. There was always a new reason to be joyful. But if you were to press me, I would say that the very happiest years of my life were with my wife, Trixie. You know, I was 54 when we married, and I was probably just ready to settle down, weary of sowing my wild oats, as the saying goes. But there was something more. We were absolutely compatible, and she had a way of calming me in my more heated moments. I think I also liked the fact that she came with a large family, which I had not enjoyed for many years, and we spent nearly 8 blissful years together before she succumbed to the cancer. It was 2 years before I began to heal, though, if I'm honest with you, I do not think I ever fully recovered from her loss.
The love of your life. Indeed. Our next question is from Victoria Bennett on a very different subject. Victoria, are you with us?
Yes, there's Victoria.
There's Victoria.
She's muted, I think.
I think Victoria's also having difficulty with this unmute issue, Mr. Whistler. There's, here, I can. Give her a second.
She seems very keen to resolve it.
And she's very keen to ask this question of you, and I'm loath to ask it for her. So let's give her a few more seconds. She's working off of a new computer. Of course, I know you don't have any understanding of what a computer is, but
I've never heard of it.
It's a very complicated thing, as many people on this call can attest to. So,
Is it anything like an abacus? Because I did have an abacus at one point.
well, actually, probably based on that system, but far more complicated.
Well, I found an abacus fairly difficult in and of itself, so I can fully understand.
Oh dear. Victoria, I'm gonna have to ask. Oh, there she is. We hear?
Yeah.
She's
So,
with us.
ooh, can you hear me? Oh, God.
We can.
Victoria.
Yeah. Oh, you can? Oh, it was so simple. Except I've lost seeing you now. Hang on. Well, I'll ask my question, even though I can't see myself.
All right.
Which doesn't matter. Mr. Whistler, I'm just going to bring up a difficult subject yet again for you, which is your relationship with Walter Greaves, who was obviously a bit of a doppelganger to you. And then you cut him out of your life completely when you got married. And he turned up at your funeral and stood at the back, which is, I felt was rather tragic. And maybe you hadn't at that point achieved your spiritual form. Maybe you were just dead. And you didn't know that he was there. Do you feel really guilty now, how you treated him?
Well, first of all, I must say that I have a better memory of my funeral than I think many people do. But that said, I really do not understand this morbid fascination the Whistler Society has with Walter Greaves. This seems to come up every time I grace one of your seances with my presence. It makes me wonder whether in your off hours you are holding seances with Mr. Greaves. Now, how exactly did I mistreat Walter? This seems to be a persistent misunderstanding. And indeed, I had been told there was an entire stage play devoted to our friendship in 1985. It even had me in love with his sister Alice, little Tinny as we called her, and breaking a promise to marry her. Now, I ask you, how preposterous can you get? Now,
she's just behind you, isn't she?
No, she is indeed. There they are. Now, both Walter and Henry were dear boys, and their sisters were dear girls, but I could hardly be expected to nurture them through life. Walter and Henry wished to emulate me and paint like me, but they simply lacked the talent. I recall an incident in the mid-1890s when they tried to honor me with a mural at the town hall in Streatham. I was out of the town at the time, but Trixie, who I must admit never warmed to the boys, described it to me in a letter as hideous, a hodgepodge of nearly every image I had ever painted, including Battersea Bridge and Carlisle and Japanese ladies and peacocks, fireworks at Cremorne Gardens, the whole being a ludicrous cavalcade of my career. But even so, I told her not to be offended on my behalf. I understood their desire to pay tribute to me, and I wrote them a letter saying as much. They were good, intelligent boys, and I always felt kindly towards them, but they were mediocre artists.
But what about him dressing like you? Did you feel that he was trying to become you?
It would take a great deal more than dressing like me for Walter Greaves to ever become James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Besides, black coats, cravats, waistcoats, at that period, most of us dressed the same, to be perfectly honest.
Thank you, Victoria. And so glad
Thank you.
finally we could hear from you.
Yes, thank you for battling through.
Yeah, I finally got the right button.
Fantastic. Our next question, we're coming back to Michael Biscoe, and it's on a very different subject.
Yes, it's a rather more domestic subject, closer to home.
Ah.
Did you find it a help, or did you find it a hindrance to have your mother living with you in Chelsea?
My mother? A hindrance? The woman who sacrificed me throughout my life? A burden? Certainly not. Our nearly 12 years together in Chelsea, before her health required that she move to Hastings and its restorative sea air, were joyous and productive years for me. Had she not been living with me, I might never have painted her famous portrait, which everyone seems to admire. She enjoyed the company of my artist friends, including the Rossettis and Algernon Swinburne. She very nearly adopted Algernon. She even helped me with one of my most successful nocturnes by bringing me brushes and paints at critical moments. Now, it's true that her presence made it more difficult to maintain my relationship with Joe, and I did entertain more lavishly and frequently after she moved to Hastings. But given my bohemian inclinations and public notoriety, you could say she had been a saint to put up with me for all those years.
Dearest Jemmy, how lovely to see you in this amazing Zoom room. Oh, thank you, Jemmy, for your kind remembrance of me in Chelsea. I know you were always concerned with my welfare, but I wish you had visited me more often. At Hastings, look how beautiful. It was such a lovely place. I know you were busy, dear, but what were you doing that was so much more important than me?
Oh, Mother, you know how dear you are to me. Do you remember how gently I carried you down the stairs to the cab when Willie and I took you to Hastings? And every work of art I ever created was made in the hope that you would find it lovely. But your move coincided with a series of crises in my life and career. Shortly after you settled in Hastings, Frederick Leyland commissioned me to create the loveliest of all my work to that time, what people now call my Peacock Room. I worked day and night for months to perfect its harmony. And how was I rewarded by that Philistine refusing to pay what he had promised me? And then came the Grosvenor exhibition and that libelous review by Ruskin. I had to take him to court. There was no alternative. My reputation and all that we had worked for would have been ruined had I not responded. You know what followed, the bankruptcy, my exile to Venice, but I never failed to write to you, dear Mother. I thought of you continually. I had fully intended to visit you when I returned from Venice, but I was immediately immersed in my etchings and pastels exhibition for the Fine Arts Society, and you passed away the day the pastel show opened to the public. I must admit, too, Mother, that when I learned how ill you had become, some part of me dreaded seeing you in your weakened condition. You'd always been so strong and so cheerful and active. It depressed me to think of you in any other way. And my consolation was that I had immortalized you in your portrait, which all the world has admired for more than 150 years. My dearest mother, we owe our immortal fame to each other.
Oh, what a beautiful tribute, Mr. Whistler. And unfortunately, your mother couldn't stay, but she did leave this little memento for you. Well, that comes to the end of our questions, and I think that we might have some interesting questions in the chat. However, I'm sensing we've lost your mother. Are we now losing you as well?
I do seem to be fading.
Can you still hear us?
Only vaguely. I think mainly I'm hearing Dickens next door. Farewell. I do hope we will meet again under more pleasant circumstances. Perhaps when you pass the veil, I will welcome you. Farewell for now.
Thank you, Mr.
Oh, goodbye.
Oh, well, how exciting was that? Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and special thanks to those fantastic questions that were submitted by the members. Dan Sutherland, for your endless insights, and Darcy, of course, for his excellent impersonation of Mr. Whistler. I think, Martin, you have something special to share with us before we...
Well, thank you, Joan. Alongside the acknowledgement of and thanks to those who put this remarkable performance together. I know how much has gone into it in the background, which no one looking at the screen would appreciate. But at the risk of a clumsy pun, an Oscar-winning performance from Darcy, remarkable, quite remarkable. So thank you all for being part of it. Thank you all for supporting the Whistler Society. And one small request. Darcy Sullivan is trying to raise money for Movember, which is a mental and physical health charity for men. Please support him in his endeavour. It's all about moustaches, and he's a man with a remarkable moustache. So in the next hour or so, or the next 24 hours, Joan will send you an email with a link to support the work of Movember. And again, thank you all so very much for being part of this. Resounding success and a terrific achievement. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Farewell.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
You remind me a little bit of Whistler's mother. I can't figure this out.
Can't figure that out either. Coincidence. Good night, all.
Very
Thank you so much.
Good night. Lovely.
Happy Christmas.
Brilliant. Brilliant.